Welcome to Truth Script Tuesday. I'm your host, John Harris. It has been a while since I have live streamed Truth Script Tuesday on my YouTube channel as well for that I usually use for the Conversations That Matter podcast. But I wanted to make an announcement to everyone that follows me on social media as well as to the normal Truth Script audience. And it concerns the Church Finder app or program that we are still in the process of developing. We're in the process right now, though, of adding churches. We need some churches to populate this particular function, this program with, before we can launch it and make it available widely. And so I want to just make this my first announcement. Some of you know that when this was maybe 3-4 years ago, when I was doing Conversations That Matter, there was a web search engine that a friend of mine created, and we advertised it on the podcast called discerningchristians.com, and it's not there anymore. That's a long story, but we have now another church search feature that is affiliated with TruthScript, which will do something very similar. It's going to be a helpful tool in finding a good local church that's not woke, that doesn't have Darwinian influence either. Those are two things expressly. They're very clear, let's just say, in our statement of faith that we are against Darwinism and woke or social justice ideology. And it's going to narrow things down for you a little bit. And this is still the number one thing that people emailing me about concerning finding churches. I just want a church that's not social justice. And it's not like other things don't matter. They do. But we really are concerned about that because so often it's subversive. It's hidden. It's maybe a church went super woke in 2020 and it's maybe they're not talking about it as much now, but they've never really repented. And so anyway, this is supposed to be a helpful tool for that. So this is what you can do for TruthScript. If you email info@truthscript.com, the information about your church, if your church fits, go to TruthScript. I should just show you, I suppose, what I'm talking about here. If you go to the website, scroll down to the bottom, and you will find About Us. Click on that, and you'll find the statement of faith. It's only 11 points. It's pretty basic, but orthodox statement of faith. And look at the language in there. If your church is a church that would fit this description, they would subscribe to these things, and they would be in general agreement, I would say, with TruthScript, then just email info@truthscript.com so that we have that, and put the church name, put the an email contact for the church, and then the address of the church. Those three things. And that's what we need initially to populate the map. And once we get enough churches to have just a basic population, we'll open it up for everyone and we can start really making this thing happen. So I just wanted to let you know that off the top, this is going to be a helpful tool. And it's funny, even in the last week, I've had a number of people email me about finding a local church. This is still a big problem out there. And so this will be one more tool to help you. While I'm saying that, I should probably just also mention TruthScript is a 501c3 organization. If you want to donate to TruthScript and our mission, then you can go to the bottom, click the donate tab. If you want to submit articles, go to the publish tab and submit articles. And many people have been submitting great articles lately. We're just going to talk about 2 of them tonight, but we have a bunch in the queue, and just so grateful for all the people that are contributing and writing. I will give you a little sneak peek of some upcoming things. We are talking about conferences right now and potentially a big conference for 2026. I can't really give any more details than that, but we've been looking at venues and we've been looking at speakers. And so that's all I'll say. For 2025, though, we're talking about doing some smaller conferences, but maybe a little bigger than what we've done this year, which will include themes that will be interesting and unique. We're considering the possibility. I don't want to hold anyone to this because this is something we have to have a longer meeting about. But I know I've talked to my brother, who's the president of TruthScript, about maybe a theme of church history and what church, talking about like American church history specifically or Reformation church history. But anyway, we're having conversations about those things, and there's just a lot of good things happening. So looking forward to making some more announcements soon, in addition to the church search feature. let's just talk a little bit about Pride Month. I actually have some questions coming in, and I don't normally take questions on the True Script Tuesday podcast, but since this is also on the streaming to the feed that I normally stream conversations that matter to, I'll take some. Do we have to be in our local church leadership, or can church members submit their churches to add to the list? This is a great question. For the initial launch, for now, you don't have to be in church leadership. We're just looking for churches that don't compromise on this stuff. So it's not an extremely high bar, but we also can take churches off. That's what we did with the Discerning Christians website, by the way. And I mean, we, not TrueScript, but myself and my friend who designed that. We had an initial population of 80 churches or something. And then there was a feature where you could add churches. And so people were adding churches. And then I think twice it came up that someone had added a church and, hey, this church actually wasn't good. In fact, in one case, a friend of mine visited the church and they said, I'm pretty sure this church is kind of social justicey. So I looked into it, and sure enough, it was, and we removed the church. So and that's the risk you run when you do this kind of thing. It's impossible. We don't have the funds to hire someone to do in-depth research on all these churches to vet them. So we're relying on you in the audience, but generally audiences are pretty reliable because you're already listening to True Script Tuesday. So there you go. Hopefully that answers the question. So if you aren't even a member, you just know of a church that maybe you used to be part of it, or you have visited it and you're familiar enough, you have friends there, you know that they fit the statement of faith, just let us know, and we'll be happy to add it to our initial list to populate that map. So that's the answer to that question. Well, with that said, I want to focus a little bit on Pride Month today, because of course it is June 4th. We're still early on, but if you're living in an area like I live, you're already seeing a lot of advertisements for Pride marches and the rainbow flags. And I don't even know what the flags are now. I mean, it's like trans flags with like circles in them for intersex and other things, and BIPOC flags, and all this stuff is coming out though. And I'm in a part of the country where it's funny, even the conservative towns, the traditional towns in New York, if you drive through them, I just did this the other day, actually, there's no rainbow flags in the town except for the church. And it's the saddest thing to me. And I don't know what to make of that exactly. It seems like the more old and traditional the church looks in the Northeast, the more likely it is to have pride celebrations and transgender or drag queen story hours and that kind of thing. And I think this is the work of Satan, of course. I think that this is on purpose. I think this is totally for the purpose of deception, to show that the place you should get truth, the place where the highest steeple, the highest point in the town where you should be able to go and find the truth, you'll actually find lies. I mean, this is a brilliant thing, honestly. I mean, that if Satan can get the churches first, right? But the evangelical churches generally don't have those old buildings. So if there's an evangelical church that doesn't go along with that, they're in a strip mall or something. So it's kind of a sad state of affairs in the Northeast. But I know other regions of the country aren't like that. When I lived in Virginia a few years ago, really nothing happened in June. Walmart, I think, had a few little displays. Actually, one display with a few little things that no one bought. And no one was decorating their house with pride stuff. But here in the Northeast, and of course, if you're in the Pacific Northwest and in an urban area, even in the South, I'm sure you're going to see a lot more of this stuff. And as the years go by and this becomes more embedded, you're going to see more and more of it. This isn't going away. This isn't going away. And the reason it's not going away is because fundamentally, this is a religious ceremony. It's a religious holiday. It's a religious month of celebration. And it's a whole month. And you can sense this with some of the religious language. In fact, I was talking to David, who's the president of TrueScript, and he was telling me the other day, have you noticed that these announcements dedicating, whether it's officials or entertainment, celebrities, whatever, that when they dedicate themselves to celebrating Pride Month in a ceremony or something, or even if it's just an announcement on television, they seem to always say, and we don't just celebrate Pride Month during the month of June. This is a celebration for all year. And it sounds so much like what you would say on Resurrection Sunday or Easter Sunday. It sounds like what you would say during Christmas time. Hey, we don't just celebrate the coming of Christ today. We celebrate it all year, but this is a special day. And you're hearing the same language now all of a sudden come out about Pride Month, that this is something to celebrate at all times. and you must celebrate it. If you don't celebrate it, then there's something wrong with you. You're hateful, you're bigoted, of course. And we know all this, right? This isn't new to us. But it might be new to some of you, I suppose, if you live in a Bible Belt area and for the first time ever, your job's decided that they're going to get on board with this. Or your town, it has a fight on their hands because there's people on the town board who want to do approve a pride parade or something like that. So, so that's what's I think that's the sense people feel. It's very dystopian if you're a traditional Christian and you're living through this. You're thinking this isn't the flavor of the month, and maybe you thought it was initially, but you're realizing this is embedded. This isn't going away. This has a lasting impact. And the whole point of it is to really take over the calendar with not just Pride Month, but all kinds of other things that will dilute the influence of traditional and mostly Christian themed holidays in the United States, and really set the focus on in other areas to, I think overall, to really paint this picture of American history that we are a people dedicated to or created by a story of emancipation. That there was a dark time in the world's history that we're coming out of. We're still coming out of. We have a long ways to go, but there were all these different labor relationships and social arrangements that were intrinsically evil. Family arrangements, all these things were bad. And so in different steps, we have kind of like a ladder. We have ever more gotten closer and closer to this goal of egalitarian equality. And you can see it, right? You can see it with the emancipation of slaves. You can see it with giving women the right to vote. These are, of course, the things that both sides of the aisle seem to come around celebrating. And now we're seeing gay marriages becoming that with both sides of the aisle. But it's also child labor laws. It's also the existence of public schools for all. It's the elimination of arranged marriages. It's maybe the first thing, of course, the rejection of any kind of divine right of a king, and the establishment of some form of quote unquote democracy, and the list goes on. And all of these things really culminate, though, in this greater equal society that we're reaching for. And so that's the story we tell of ourselves. It's not the story, I think, even when I was a kid, there was still the story of heroism, of accomplishing great things for your people. We're proud of Neil Armstrong, proud of George Washington, proud of American heroes who just really accomplished great things. Henry Ford, and people who invented things and built things and won wars. And it was this, there was this sort of heroism motif, and young men could look up to heroes from America's past because that was our story. We were people who accomplished much. We built skyscrapers, and in everything we did, even if we were, because every country does bad things and wrong things, but even despite wrong things that we did, there was something good to say about the United States of America, because in general, we had a moral code we lived by, whether it was the code of, the Western civilization that had come before us, the knight, the cavalier, or in the uniquely American sense, the cowboy. The cowboy kind of encapsulated all of this as this quintessential American figure that was some independent, and not in a bad way, but actually I think in a good way. This is often knocked by pastors, by the way, like this, American individualism. And I got to be careful here, because there's an American individualism that's bad, or an individualism that's bad. But this individualism, this self-sufficiency, this is a bad thing. Actually, I think if we're defining it right, it was a good thing. It was this idea that people in the United States were built to subdue and conquer, but not just to do that in this really masculine way, but also to protect the weak, to preserve things. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt being kind of this character. We're going to preserve nature. We're going to use power for the right things. We have a moral code we operate by, which sets the limits on what we can do. But there is this meekness. There is this power under control, and we're going to stick up for the underdog. And this has, I think, been somewhat exploited, this sticking up for the underdog, using power to do that, to now sticking up for all these victim groups, but they're weaponized against the center, against the core of American identity. The heritage Americans who built the country, the people who trace back to the founding, they're the bad guys now. So anyway, all that to say, I realize this is True Script Tuesday, not Conversations That Matter podcast, and I need to talk about these articles, but all that to say, This is just one more link in a chain that's been woven for years, that's been attempting to take that heroism story that we tell about ourselves, and we say, this is why we're significant, because we have people of internal character and virtue who took these brave, heroic stands to make this country what it is, and we overcame obstacles to do it. To now, it's a story of various victim groups who are not the majority, who were able to gain some form of equality or egalitarian independence, uh, despite what the majority did to them or wanted to do to them. So it's actually an attacking kind of the core of American identity. The people who were heroes are no longer heroes. They're actually the villains now under this new paradigm. And that's really, I think, what Pride Month is about. It's a religious holiday to commemorate this new story we tell about ourselves. And it's a religious story. And I think the story we told about ourselves before had religious elements too. I mean, you can't really escape that. But it was more Christian. There was a more because the internal virtues were very much Christian virtues that coincided with and were the inspiration for the American virtues. And you saw this in, like, even things like, Roy Rogers' cowboy code and stuff like that. So those internal virtues don't seem to matter anymore. Really, the only thing that matters is whether social arrangements are equal or not, whatever that means. So that's my commentary. Matt says no more nights. Yeah, no more nights, unfortunately. Do you agree that Michael says the church should teach LGBT history, Jude 1:7? So yeah, should we teach the truth about what the Bible teaches about homosexuality, and especially the Sodom and Gomorrah, and just the negative things that God did to judge sinners, homosexuality being one sin? Yeah, obviously. You teach the whole counsel of God, and that includes that. So if you have comments, I guess why not? Yeah, leave a comment, leave a question, and I'll be happy to get to that. We have a lot of people streaming right now. So we're 17 minutes in, and I really need to get to the topic at hand, or at least the articles at hand. But I wanted to start off with that by just acknowledging this is where we're at. This is why you feel the way you do, even if you can't put words to it. You feel like your country's being taken away from you when you look at this. It's not just the celebration of homosexuality. You're looking at something much larger. And this is one link in that chain. This is one front in which the story that you tell about yourself and you tell your children about America is now being subsumed by this news story that's being told. And of course, it's in everything. It's in Sesame Street. It's in this. I didn't know who this person was. I'm having a kid soon, though, so I understand this is a person that kids listen to, and a lot of Christian parents allow their kids to listen to, named Miss Rachel. And she celebrated Pride Month. She interviewed Dylan Mulvaney, who is the quote unquote transgender male who thinks they're transgender, thinks they're a woman, who was on the Bud Light cans, if you remember that controversy. And she has millions of followers on YouTube. And I was struck by this, by the way. She made a statement about why she's supporting Pride Month, LGBT, etc. And this is what she had to say.
Shared prayers on here before and said, God bless. And that's because my faith is really important to me. And it's also one reason why I love every neighbor. In Matthew 22, a religious teacher asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And Jesus says to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. There's no greater commandments than these. I believe it's mentioned 8 times, love your neighbor. So yes, everyone belongs, everyone's welcome, everyone is treated with empathy and respect. It doesn't say love every neighbor except. There are so many reasons I stand strong in love. I stand with everyone. That's who I am. And the love back and the God bless if you disagree is genuine.
Okay, so the reason I wanted to play that for you before getting to the article about Voddie Baucham's book is because this is the logic you are going to encounter in the church to justify everything I just talked about. And this is the same thing. The same argument has been used on other social issues in the past. When the Bible speaks explicitly, I'll give you one right now that's being debated in the Southern Baptist Convention, shall we? Women in pastoral leadership roles. The argument that's used to justify that is that there's an overriding narrative in scripture to love. And that overriding spirit of the Bible is enough to overcome the clear passages where Paul says things like, I do not permit a woman to speak. So you have this principle that is used as a sledgehammer for what the Bible clearly teaches, against what the Bible clearly teaches. And it's the same move, and I've seen it over and over again with other social matters. And it's just, this is the new iteration of it. And I hate to say this, but normally it works. If the past 200 years or 100 years are any example, this works. People generally go for this. It's a way to justify and to really get the target off your back. Doesn't that feel good to not have a target on your back all the time? You can be a Christian. You can say God bless. You can have your Christian things. You can listen to Christian music and go to church, and you don't have to take the hate and the heat from the world. So this is a way to get around that. And it sounds super convincing until you really think about it. But it's obviously, the problem is that the commandments of God, the summation of all of them is to love God and love your neighbor. So the commandments themselves are actually ways to love. They're the outpouring, the specific outpouring of what love looks like. This is how you treat your neighbor. You don't sleep with your neighbor's wife, right? You don't sodomize your neighbor, right? I know that sounds graphic, but that's what they're doing, right? That's what is being supported here. You don't do that. That's actually a hurtful thing. That's God speaks out against that in no uncertain terms. It's an abomination. And that God defines what love is. And that's one of the ways we know is from his commandments, right? This is imposing a foreign definition of what love is, and acceptance and tolerance, as if they're synonymous with love, onto the scripture. And I know that there are people in this audience who are right now battling this with their pastors, with just maybe people in their church who want to see more quote unquote acceptance in their minds. This is what they're saying. And I know people personally, by the way, who have used this logic to justify their own internal desires, and they want to keep their Christianity. People I've known closely. And they just say, you know what, this is the story of scripture. And because of that, I am justified in my homosexual desires. So I want you to be aware. All right. That's what's happening in the world, but that's also what's happening in the church. Right. And it's happening more and more and more, which is why I think books like Voddie Baucham's are so important. That's the first book that I want to talk about today. We're going to talk about Rediscovering Womanhood as well. But I want to talk about this review that Justin Puckett wrote. And I'm so glad he did, by the way. I just want to say thank you to Justin, because I read this book by Voddie Baucham months ago. In fact, if you go to the Amazon web link or whatever, in fact, maybe I won't do it. It'll take up too much time, but you'll see my endorsement there for this book. And so I'm in support of it, but I didn't have time over the weekend because I had my brother's wedding and I had family visiting, and I took a few days off just to be with family coming out from California and other places. And I asked Justin, I said, hey, Voddie's book is coming out soon. Could you do a review of this? And he did it in like 2 days, which I was impressed. He just read it and wrote an excellent review. So I'm going to go through some of his review, and I'm also going to add my own remarks as we go. First, he gives you a quote from the book. This book comes out, by the way, I think in 2 days, and you can go to Amazon and get it. It's called, like I said, It's Not Like Being Black by Voddie Baucham. And it starts off with this quote: the sexual revolution is now apparent. It is now apparent, has been about much more than simply discarding sexual inhibitions and restrictions. Like all revolutions, it has been driven from the start by revolutionaries seeking power. I'm so glad that Voddie Baucham said this. That's exactly right. It is that. And it was framed in such a way that this was not about seeking power. This was just like, gay marriage isn't going to affect your marriage. People having a march outside you don't have to go if you don't like it. Why should you care about what people do in their bedrooms? We're not bothering you, right? That's how this was all sold to us. And of course, this was only a means to power. This was to take over the calendar. This was to get recognition socially. It was to normalize. And then after normalization, to weaponize the power that they had gained against those who would disagree. He says, he talks about Voddie's issues being really surrounding biblical fatherhood and raising a Christian family. And I couldn't agree more. I think that's where Voddie shines. That's what he has really dedicated himself to. And these are the issues of our day. I think it's one of the reasons he's popular, is because he was kind of on the ground floor of being concerned about many of these things. And he's taken no uncertain stand against homosexuality and the threat it is to your family. He says that there's been a number of books. So why another one? Why another book? And he says, hey, despite all the books that have been written refuting homosexuality from Christian perspectives, there's still the inroads are still being made. You see what happened recently in the United Methodist Church, and how they made a heretical decision on the matter. All the while, the SBC continues to play footsie with it. And Jared Moore wrote an article recently for Baptist leadership. What is it? I'm trying to remember the organization. Center for Baptist Leadership. He wrote a whole article for them talking about how this is starting to be normalized in the Southern Baptist Convention, the side B Christianity, side homosexual desires. So he says, no, this is relevant. This is still happening. And Voddie Baucham writing a book about this is certainly something that's still needed. So he talks a little bit about who Voddie Baucham is. And then he goes, he gives his assessment, which I agree with, by the way, which is that it's a great book for the layman who wants something kind of simple. And that's, I think, the strength of Voddie Baucham books is they are pretty simple. They are accessible to the layman. They're not academic works, but they have a lot of very true, like there's a lot of citations in them. There's he can simplify some academic things. And so I think that's a very helpful thing for the average layman who wants to understand these issues. So he starts off the book with this comparison that's often trotted out there, that gay is the new black. And that, and like I described to you earlier, like rungs on a ladder, we took the step before the civil rights step. And the next logical step is to apply these civil rights to homosexuals and transgenders, etc., and not just limit it to racial minorities, but also quote unquote sexual minorities. And one of the problems with this, there are a number, but one of the problems is that God created people differently. And so it's good. It's good that God created different people groups. It's true diversity like that is actually a good thing. It's part of God's creation. God created Europeans and different kinds of Europeans. He created Africans and different kinds of Africans and Asians, etc. And this is something that's part of the created order. But guess what is not part of the created order? Well, you guessed it, homosexuality, right? And you know this by scripture, right? You also know this by nature itself, the natural revelation that God has given us. And so he quotes Romans, let love be without hypocrisy, by abhorring what is evil, clinging to what is good. We wouldn't apply this to other sins. We wouldn't say other sins, thievery is the new black or something, right? We wouldn't say other sexual sins are the new black or, whatever. But we will with this. And so one of the things that Voddie Baucham does is he talks about the Loving case in Virginia, which was used to topple anti-miscegenation laws, essentially laws that said that you could not marry someone of another race or ethnicity. And Voddie attacks the Virginia's law because it invalidated it at least in some cases, in the Loving case, was it would validate a legitimate marriage in the eyes of God. So two people racially different marrying each other is still a valid marriage in the eyes of God. And so in a sense, the state was imposing a restriction in this case on marriage that now I think Voddie says change the definition of marriage, but I guess what I would say is that it didn't fundamentally change the definition by saying it's not a man or a woman or anything, but it did toy with marriage by restricting it in ways that God did not restrict it. And then and this is the really egregious part, I suppose, going the extra step of saying, and if you violate our law, then what you have isn't really a marriage, right? Even though God says it is. So they're restricting the definition of marriage, right? In this case, what they're doing, though, is they're expanding the definition of marriage in the Obergefell decision. And they're saying it can be all of these other things, right? That aren't actually marriage in the eyes of God, right? So in the case of the loving case, they weren't saying that things are marriages that God does not say, that God says are not marriages, that God says are abominations, but they were saying that certain things that actually legitimately are marriages aren't, or we don't recognize them legally. In this case, and this is, I think, much worse, to be honest with you, it's opening Pandora's box for there is no definition of marriage anymore at all. We're just getting rid of definitions. That's the effect of the Obergefell case. And so Voddie makes this comparison and says, look, it was what happened in some of these anti-miscegenation laws was bad. What's happening now is also bad, and for similar reasons, or at least you can draw some parallels. And the reason is because Genesis 2, it says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh, and that's it. Man, woman, right? And they leave their father and mother, they cleave to each other. That's a marriage. They become one flesh. And this is something that God joins together. Now, Justin says there's two things in the book that struck him. One, the topic of this book is heavy and uncomfortable, similar to the horrors of abortion. To some extent, we must resist the temptation to close our eyes and plug our ears and pretend it doesn't exist. And I will tell you, there are sections in this book, don't eat before you read them. Don't read them to your children. He talks about some things that are disturbing, frankly. He gets into Kinsey and what the Kinsey studies, the prisoners and their sexual habits. It's not for the faint of heart. And he's not afraid to go there, which I appreciate. It's really important, by the way, that we understand that, because oftentimes homosexuality is looked at upon like, oh, it's just the rainbow. It's sunshine and roses. Of course, it's appropriate for a kid's show because it's a style. It's an aesthetic, and it's not. Think about what they're doing. Think about what they're saying, right? Some may say they don't want to know because it still just makes them sick and angry. Well, brother or sister, you should be sick and angry, right? Don't lose your gag reflex. Proverbs 8:13 says, the fear of Yahweh is to hate evil, pride and arrogance in the evil way, and the mouth of the perverted words I hate. We should hate what's happening, and there's a healthy hatred there. We can't bury our heads in the sand on this stuff. He talks about neutrality being a myth, that there is no neutrality. There is no way to have a principled pluralism where Christians can operate and in the public square, and so can the homosexual lobby. It's one will eat the other. There's no way for them both to do it. And it will bleed into things like pedophilia. And I know homosexual activists, they'll jump down your throat when you say that. And, of course, that's not true. We're not pedophiles. No, not saying you are. But the same logic employed to justify homosexuality is the same logic employed to justify pedophilia. There is no way to stem or the growth of pedophilia using the arguments that are used to justify homosexuality. Voddie Baucham says this on page 124. All arguments about ultimate truth are in effect religious arguments. The devout secularists is not free of theological presuppositions. He is dogmatic as I am. The difference is that he does not acknowledge his presuppositions. Instead, he pretends to be a dispassionate seeker of truth. And that's a lie. Voddie also says, I am not just grasping at extremes, but making a point that should be obvious. If we decide what we will or will not condone in the realm of human sexuality without the benefit of a set standard, there's no limit to the levels of debauchery and chaos into which we will sink. And that's the point I just made. If there isn't a limit, then it's Pandora's box. It's whatever goes. There are some fascinating quotes, I'm going to say, in this book. One of them he quotes here from 1987. Listen to this from Steve Warren in a leading gay publication called The Advocate. And the article is called A Warning to Homophobes. And this is what it says. 1987. You can either let us marry people of the same sex or, better yet, abolish marriage altogether. You will be expected to offer ceremonies that bless our sexual arrangements. You will also instruct your people in homosexual as well as heterosexual behavior, and you will go out of your way to make certain that homosexual youths are allowed to date, attend religious functions together, openly display affection, and enjoy each other's sexuality without embarrassment or guilt. Does this read like what we're seeing right now? This was in 1987. If any of the older people in your midst object, you will deal with them sternly, making certain they renounce their ugly and ignorant homophobia or suffer public humiliation. You will also make certain that laws are passed forbidding discrimination against homosexuals, and heavy punishments are assessed. Finally, we will in all likelihood want to expunge a number of passages from your scriptures and rewrite others, eliminating preferential treatment of marriage and using words that will allow for homosexual interpretations of passages describing biblical lovers such as Ruth and Boaz, or Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Warning, if all these things do not come to pass quickly, we will subject Orthodox Jews and Christians to the most sustained hatred and vilification in recent memory. We have captured the liberal establishment and the press. We have already beaten you on a number of battlefields. You will have neither the faith nor the strength to fight us, so you might as well surrender now. So Voddie Baucham quotes this from 1987, over 30 years ago. This is a popular homosexual magazine, The Advocate. And this is what Steve Warren had to say about the future. And we're living it. And maybe the last foot hasn't quite dropped on this, but it's dropping. We're in the process, maybe the early stages. And this will be the defining thing, I think, for the church going forward, is whether they're going to go along with this or not. And let me tell you something. The churches that went along with COVID, went along with the BLM stuff, won't go along with especially women pastors and that kind of thing. Those are the churches that will inevitably cave to this. Unless they do a complete 180 and realize that what they did in those times was wrong, they will completely cave to this. And I can guarantee it. They might be strong now, but the ethos, the spirit that led to their compromise in those areas will also lead them to compromise in this area inevitably. You can't stop it because they have already made the spirit of the age their authority. And they've already allowed it to override clear teaching in Scripture. And what they've done is they have made themselves so vulnerable to the concerns of bigotry that the culture, or I should say the world, imposes upon them, that there's no reason to think they're going to be able to stand strong on this issue long term. I think in some cases it may take a generation, but it will inevitably happen. And it's already happened in the mainline denominations. There's really no doubt about it. It's just starting in the evangelical church, which is why a book like Voddie's is important. And why actually, honestly, we need more books like this. And on my other podcast, my Conversations That Matter podcast, I do plan to tackle this subject more and more and over again and give you more and more tools and more voices who are fighting this, because you need it. This isn't going away. So anyway, moving on, not to black pill everyone here, but he talks about the strategy being employed, kind of mirroring the civil rights movement. He quotes Voddie again from page 89. At the time of this writing, all public institutions are required to recognize same-sex marriage in their policies. Private institutions have been spared so far, but it can't remain that way for long. You know, and this is one of the things, can I just say this? Christians who are in petty arguments, and I mean petty, in turf wars over whose conference is the biggest and who's got the big donors in their particular ministry, and who, you know, ministries that, you know, blacklist and gatekeep. And I know the behind the scenes of some of this in conservative circles. It's all silly to me. And this is one of the reasons, because, okay, you think you're a big shot right now. You realize the pressure coming on you in the next few years or in the next decades. Do you realize what's coming? We have to pursue as much as possible power for using power in the right way, for Christians to use it to love their neighbor. At the same time, we have to have a strategy for diffusion and local churches that can operate in ways that this pressure does not apply to them and they're shielded against it, because the big organizations will be imposed upon. You will lose your 501c3. Unless something miraculous happens, that's just where the pendulum is going. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Let's keep going here, and just there's a lot of good stuff in this review. By the way, share these reviews. If you appreciate what True Script is doing, you appreciate this information, share this stuff on your social media. It helps us out so much. Sign up for the True Script emails and you'll get these in your inbox. I'm just giving some of my comments and reviewing these articles, but you can get the full thing, and sharing it really does help us out. So Voddie talks about, the positive vision for sex that God has, why he created sex. talks about the gospel and stories like from Rosaria Butterfield and Christopher Yuan about how they went from homosexual relationships to now being Christians who honor God with their lives. And so he just recommends this book. Now, I want to add some of my own to this, if I may. I wanted to read for you. I'm not going to show it on the screen, but I wanted to read something for you from the book because it's not available yet. I have an advanced copy, though. But anyway, one of the things that Voddie says, and this will be interesting to many of you. This was interesting to me as a history guy. Voddie went somewhere that people rarely go. They rarely go here, okay? It's not popular to do this. And I thought this was actually, especially in conservative evangelicalism, the riskiest thing Voddie did in this book. He went after MLK. And MLK has become somewhat of a golden calf, I would say, even in more conservative-leaning circles. And we've talked about MLK on this podcast before. And really, the vast majority of his contributions being not good. And we remember, it's like one line from one speech that people remember him for on the conservative side. But obviously, there's much more to him. And I would recommend people, if they really want to know more, either listen to my podcast on it or go read Cornel West's The Radical King to find out what I'm talking about. But Voddie Baucham doesn't have a problem criticizing MLK a little bit and talking about the early civil rights movement. Let me read this to you. He says, when I first set out to write this book, I was convinced that the gay movement of the 80s and 90s was engaging in a strategy to hijack the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, right? Have you ever heard this? They're hijacking it. This is what he says. Then I stumbled upon this quote from civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, proving it. Now, Bayard Rustin, for those who don't know, Bayard Rustin was honored by President Obama. Ronald Reagan said nice things about him. By the end of his life, he was a neoconservative, but early in his life, he was a communist. And he was instrumental in things like the March on Washington and the Montgomery bus boycott. And, these civil rights kind of emblematic times and certain things that happened. He was behind much of it. And he was part of of MLK's organization, helped co-found it, actually. And this is what Rustin had to say. Today, blacks are no longer the litmus paper or the barometer of social change. Blacks are in every segment of society, and there are laws that help to protect them from racial discrimination. So this is after the civil rights movement. The new N-words are gays. It is in this sense that gay people are the new barometer for social change. The question of social change should be framed with the most vulnerable group in mind, gay people. This is Bayard Rustin. And that is how the civil rights movement, quote unquote, is portrayed today. That is this is so far we have to go. I mean, this is who's the guy? Black Liberation Theology. Now, why am I forgetting his name? Someone remind me of his name in the chat group. I don't know why this is escaping me. I'm going to have to look him up now, even though I've read so much of his stuff. Too much information crammed in my mind at once. Let's see. James something, right? James Cone. Why did I forget that name? It should be on the tip of my tongue. Okay, James Cone. So James Cone, the last book he wrote before he died, he makes the same argument, basically. And so he talks about that. This is a guy on the ground floor with MLK. And then he not only stop, he doesn't stop there. He goes, Rustin was a member of the Communist Party. He went to India in the 1940s to study Gandhi's nonviolent tactics. He later met MLK in the 50s and went on to become one of Key's leading strategists, advisors, and ghostwriters. And he was homosexual himself. Then he talks, let's see, where is it? About Stanley Levinson. Stanley Levinson co-wrote the I Have a Dream speech. He was on the ground floor too, one of the most instrumental people behind MLK. And a ghostwriter, essentially, part of King's organization. And King and Levinson also agreed, Voddie Baucham says, that Rustin and fellow civil rights activist James Baldwin were more qualified to lead a homosexual movement. So it is not the case that the homosexual movement suddenly decided to hitch its wagon to another successful movement after the fact. The two movements were very much intertwined as far back as the 1950s. Let me say it again. The two movements, the civil rights movement that you think of, and the LGBTQ plus normalization movement, these two movements were very much intertwined as far back as the 1950s. And what united them was a commitment to neo-Marxist ideals. That is exactly what I was saying at the beginning of this podcast, that it's part of a much bigger picture, and you have to look at it that way. This is a much bigger thing. I mean, it's much, in the spiritual sense, it's much bigger, right? This is angels and demons stuff. But in our context in the United States, this is part of an egalitarian move to reframe what America is, who Americans are, what their history is, what they ought to be proud of, what they ought to be employing themselves in achieving. That's what this is. So I wanted to point that out for you just as a tidbit, that I think Voddie Baucham is brave to make that connection. So yeah, it's not the new black, but guess what? He's acknowledging, hey, civil rights movement had a poison pill from the beginning on this issue. And I'm glad he did it, because someone needed to say it. And lots of people have known this for a long time, but few are afraid to say it. So questions and comments, we will get to them. Question for later. New women's Bible study, which I usually avoid, using the book The Well-Watered Women by Gretchen Scaffels. Wondering if you know about her. I do not. I do not. If other people ask me about it, maybe I'll look into it. Yeah, and Kyle says, I'm looking forward to hearing your review of Voddie Baucham's newest book. And this is kind of it. This is True Script. Sneak peek, I will have on the Conversations That Matter podcast, I will have Voddie Baucham on soon to talk about it. So we will have Voddie on. And if you have questions for Voddie, you can actually probably leave them on comments on this video, and I'll try to incorporate some of those. Hey, John, thoughts on Baucham and Virgil Walker's appearing with Glenn Beck at the Fearless Army Roll Call 2.0, a so-called Christian men's conference? Well, this is where I'm going to say, you got to check out my other podcast, Conversations That Matter, because I will talk about it later this week. I am very aware of it. And yes, I was in contact with one of the speakers at that event. I won't say who. And so, yeah, I won't say anything more than that. I'm a little disappointed with what happened there. But yeah, I do have some thoughts on that. All right. Let's move on here. There are some more comments coming in, but let's get to this next article, which I really do want to get to. And this is an article that is a little bit different, but it's connected. Rediscovering Womanhood. Once you start softening gender, that's how you end up getting to the LGBTQ plus stuff. And the softening of gender stuff, that's happening whether someone's full-fledged embracing LGBT or not. So Diane Warner, who really does a great job writing for the podcast, great writer, and just great. She's generous. She's been a supporter of the Conversations That Matter podcast for a while. But she says, not long ago, the "What is a woman?" question backed some otherwise intelligent people into an unexpected corner. Talking about the Matt Walsh documentary, I believe. And long before people made it all the way into that corner, there have been other vagaries in our cultural thinking, though, she says. So this is a point many have made. There are compromises along the way. You don't just overnight get to heresy. You don't overnight say, I'm going to reject the created order. There's little compromises. So she acknowledges that. And then she wants to talk about what has been lost. So we don't actually know much about the pre-fall womanhood. The primary descriptor we are given is that Eve was created to be a suitable helper for Adam. This implies that her very nature was to function in close relationship with another person, specifically a man, and of course, eventually with their children as well. It also carries the understanding that there was a designated calling given to Adam that would benefit from what she contributed. Perhaps we learn more from considering what the fall inverted in her nature. Her impulse to dominate suggests that the original submissive and cooperative spirit of womanhood, or character of womanhood, was most directly corrupted. But another residue of the fall, evident in all women, still is with us today, and that's a sense of insecurity. Thus, for them, the desire to control isn't so much driven by pride, as it is true for fallen men, as it is by fear. They no longer trust men, and by extension, they no longer trust God. This is just a brilliant take, I have to say. Womanhood obscured. She says, while the presentation and roles of womanhood over the centuries have been notably varied, we now live in an era where these seem almost entirely hidden from view through the efforts of feminism, which morphed from mild to militant. Women have been drawn into an illusion that they are most fully human to the extent that they live out of the characteristics and callings of men. So strangely complicit in this process have been men themselves for a few possible reasons. First, A fallen nature of manhood includes a strong pull towards laziness. Have you noticed this? I have. But even for those who would endeavor to retain their position of leadership, a growing swell of cultural pressure to give women what they were demanding has proven to shape the dominant patterns of modern society. One of the greatest challenges to restoring womanhood in its true expression is the reality that women who are most visible and influential are often the ones most ensnared in the deceptions. And young girls are taught both directly and by example that they must take and retain control of their lives in every way possible. I've seen this so many times, and I've seen this, by the way, in the most conservative of churches, the most conservative of women's conference. You're a child of the king, and that translates into you're powerful. You got girl power. Yeah, there is girl power, I guess. Like, girls have influence. My wife has influence over me. Sure, they have something, and I can't even quantify it for you exactly. The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, but that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about we can kind of compete with the men. We can be aggressive like the men. We have girl power. We don't need them. They're obsolete. We're the strong ones, right? That's what's going on, even the most conservative churches so often. And it's disgusting, frankly. It's repulsive, and it leads to this homosexual stuff. And you may not think so, but you start softening the gender differences, and that's eventually what you're going to get. That's the root of the transgender stuff. It's been in motion for decades. And they pay a high price for this because she talks about how many women now are single. And then, I got to say this because I don't want women who are single, who are well-meaning, want a strong, good, godly husband, and they've prayed and they've tried to find that. She's not talking about you, okay? That is one of the hardest things and something I pray about for the people I know who have that situation, and also the men in similar situations. But there's a larger group, I would say, of females out there who have taken this feminist path and want to be strong, want to be independent, want to be self-sufficient, and it pushes the men away. And they end up at late points in their life, in their 30s or 40s, and they're getting past their childbearing years. They turn around and they say, why am I not married? Why did I not have those things? And those are the things that actually would fulfill me more. And they realize it, and it's almost too late. They're not going to have as many kids if they do get married, or maybe they won't have kids. And it's just a sad thing. One of the things that we should avoid is simply imposing external patterns that emulate the norms of earlier days. So back when men went to work and women stayed at home, it's not that simple, nor was that the most righteous time in history. But humanity was still fully impacted by the fall, and the only resolution to that has always been a supernatural one. And I think there's some truth to this. It's good. It is good to look back. Leave It to Beaver days were better in so many ways, but they had their problems. Don't idealize it. Don't make it the end all be all. Like there were problems back then, and there's problems today. And so we have a model. We have from God what we need to get back to the created order, and that's the important thing. That's what I'm writing my next book on. Is that very issue. To some extent, the answer to this question depends on one's view of biblical eschatology. With regard to humanity as a whole, what most prophecy seems to suggest is that it will require the presence of Christ ruling on earth to restore godly ordering to all aspects of society, including male and female relationships. But setting that aside, how possible is it for us as individual believers to regain those qualities of relationship more closely resembling God's original design? An obvious first step would be to clarify what that ordering should look like. What are godly femininity and masculinity? Surprisingly, the best way to envision this might not be to think about a woman and men at all, but rather to consider the spiritual reality their relationship was intended to typify. According to Paul, human marriages contain God's clues to the mystery that is the relationship of what? Christ and the church. So there are limits, of course, to this as far as men fall short of Christ's perfections, but the general pattern is for men representing Christ to lead, provide for, and protect their families, and women representing the church to gladly follow their leadership, gratefully receive what they are given, and thereby flourishing in a way that brings honor to their leader. Isn't it so simple when you think of it that way? It just clarifies everything. Let's be real. She says, with that as an ideal, how do we get from A to B? And because our question at hand is regarding womanhood, we'll focus on that. Foundationally, a woman must discover the reliability of God to protect and provide for her, not in theory, but in the grittiness of her realities, and especially when the men in her life have let her down. So trust God is really the first step here. That's not what you would think, right? And let me just say this about the trad wife movement. I don't know a lot about it. I'm generally positive about wives wanting to be traditional because that's a good thing. But it can't be just an aesthetic. It can't be just the sourdough thing, right? It really does need to start with this. I'm going to trust God. And I know that I'm not sufficient to meet my own needs. I don't have it in me. I'm not enough, but there is a God. And yeah, he designed me to be with a man, but he also understands my plight. He understands my needs, and he's there. That's step number one. I think this is great. The other thing that should be helpful is to understand that she is not being called to some sort of mindless servility, whereas Christ doesn't really need the counsel of the church. Human men require that kind of help. One image to consider is the king and his counselor. I get counsel from my wife all the time, by the way. Because women are not only given different capacities for grasping and interpreting various aspects of life, but are often strongly gifted in other ways as well, men stand to benefit significantly from them. Ultimately, both parties need to realize that God will hold men responsible for the leadership. And she goes on to rediscovering womanhood, last few paragraphs. What is womanhood? While we will never be able to fully comprehend the depths and mysteries of our sexual natures, clearly women have been designed to exemplify rich aspects of godliness and beauty. We see glimpses of this in Scripture, in Esther's submission, in Jael's courage, in Ruth's loyalty, Hannah's faithfulness, Abigail's wisdom, and most especially Mary's surrender. Behold the maidservant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. And so reframing who you are before God will reframe who you are before a man and how that relationship works. That's what the main thrust of this article is. And I would say that goes for just gender in general, whether it's a marriage relationship or not. All right, more questions and comments, and then we're going to land the plane. We have almost 500 people streaming right now. And yes, not many questions, but we have people recommending other Voddie interviews. And I don't know what this has to do with anything. A coworker of mine who was 43 and had 4 doses of the COVID vax still managed to give birth to her first baby, and she's healthy. Okay. We weren't talking about that exactly, but I'm grateful for that. That's good. So I would just say that to wrap this all up, God has a creative design, and the egalitarian motif in our Western cultures and in the United States at present seeks to override this and create a new kind of utopia full of equality or equity, diversity, inclusion, which is the terms they're using now, but it's been equality for a long time. And this social equality is supposed to usher in some kind of era of good times, good feelings. It's going to correct all our problems. But really what it does is it creates new ones. And these new ones are, these cures are much worse than the disease. And we're seeing it with the LGBT stuff, but we're also seeing it with just basic, I don't want to get too personal, but I just know in my own life, even this last week, I have had a number of situations where friends of mine, people I know, are having marriage issues, severe ones in some cases. And most of it comes down to this very issue, believing lies about what their roles are. And we have to get back to what the Lord has given us in his word and how he's created us by nature, really, by the created, the revelation in nature, natural revelation. So that's the gist of today's episode. And if you could help us, we'd appreciate it. We really need, like I said, email info@truthscript.com. Send us those churches. We want churches that are, not woke. Go check out our statement of faith at TruthScript and are in line with basic Orthodox theology. And we're going to populate them on our church search map. And that's a tool to help you. A lot of people have asked for this, and we're helping out. Pray for us at TruthScript as well. We got a number of things on the horizon that we're trying to plan, and we just want them to be successful for the kingdom and glory of God. And also, if you can share around the articles, if you like what you hear, that's the best way you can support us. So God bless. More coming. Bye now.